Today we're talking about passive and active voice and how we can make intentional choices for clarity in our sentences by understanding the difference between the two. First, we have to start with a wee dram of grammar. The subject plus the verb plus the noun in this first sentence gives us an active voice sentence. I lost the money. You might notice that the verb is past tense, that it happened in the past. That's okay. Some people get confused between passive and past, but any verb can be active and any verb can be passive. In this case, the emphasis is on me losing that money. And so that subject is in that subject slot. The agent of the action is doing it right there at the beginning, and I can emphasize my irresponsibility with that money. In the second sentence, we have a subject plus a being verb plus a prepositional phrase. We don't really need that prepositional phrase there in order to convey that information, and we've talked about that in our classes already about how too many prepositional phrases can clutter up a sentence. But in this case, the emphasis on the money instead of on the person who lost the money requires that we have a prepositional phrase at the end. The money was lost by me. There might be a reason to choose that construction. If you want to focus on the money, maybe shift the heat away from the person who lost it. Those are possibilities, but you need to know the difference so that you can make an informed choice. It's really a matter of precision. The Williams text style, Lessons in Clarity and Grace, offers us one of these examples. It is argued that the Vietnam War was fought to extend influence in Southeast Asia. That's one of those sentences that maybe sounds smart, but when we start to tease out the foundations of that sentence, we have questions. Who argued? Who fought? If you can figure out those things and answer those questions, you can have a stronger sentence. Historian Ted Keller argues that the United States fought only to extend influence in Southeast Asia. Now I know a lot more about that sentence, and that sentence feels a lot more informational to me. I have a better sense of what's going on, and it conveys ethos, right? You understand a lot more about what you're writing about, and so your reader does as well. When you want to choose the best verb for your sentence, you need to know a few things. To choose an active voice sentence, you might want that verb because knowing who is doing the action will lend ethos or clarity, as in identifying our historian or who was doing the fighting in the previous sentence. You might want to just declutter a sentence, get rid of some of those prepositional phrases and put the person who's doing the action or the agent of that action in the subject slot. And you also might want to focus attention on the action being completed rather than on the thing that has received that action. So in the case of the money, the emphasis there is on the money being lost rather than the losing of the money. In many cases, it shifts responsibility. So if I say the money was lost by me, there's less intentional responsibility. If I say I lost the money, there seems to be more responsibility being taken by the agent of the subject. If you want to choose a passive voice construction, there are reasons why you might do that. And when I was in high school, I was told never to write in passive voice, and we were marked off for it. But as with most hard and fast grammatical rules and style rules that we've been taught, there are some exceptions, and there is a lot of power in your writing to being aware of those choices and just making intentional moves in your prose. You choose the passive construction when knowing what is being done is more important than who is doing it. For instance, in an experiment, we might be much more interested in the things being done than in focusing on the researcher dropping in the droplets or whatever that might be. You also might want to emphasize particular information, like the money or something else being done. You might also, and Williams doesn't talk about this too much, but I think it's an important thing, especially for rhetoric purposes, to shift pathos, as in the Declaration of Independence. When Jefferson writes the Declaration of Independence, many of his verbs are passive in construction, and it has the effect of shifting our our empathy and our sympathy toward the writers of the Declaration of Independence. It makes the king look as if he's victimizing the people, and he was, and so it just helps make their case a little bit stronger. And that's an interesting and helpful rhetorical move. So some related choices that we need to talk about as well. Do we use first person when we write? Do we talk about first person plural? Can you use the word I? Can you use the word we? Those things, William says, are options, and I agree to a certain extent, but you need to be careful with them. I think that it is much more appropriate to use the word I, the first person, than it is to use the first person plural, unless you are writing with a group of people. So sometimes using the first person plural can falsely engage your readers in agreement with you when you haven't earned their agreement. So be careful about that, and if you have questions, just make sure that you're bringing it up to your peer review group or to me in class. When we talk about meta discourse, that's talking about the writing in the writing, and we've talked about this a little bit before, but it's important here as we talk about making choices in our writing. We do not want process language, that is, when I was reading this book I found, or the second time I read the poem I noticed. I don't need any of those kinds of things. I'm assuming that you went through that process, and it's cumbersome to read, so don't include it. Don't include references to the paper in the paper. And I know William says that some people do this, and they do, but that's also one of those perpetuated things that I think has come down, just like he talks about in the beginning with the really obtuse discourse that we've seen. If you're reading a paper, it's clearly a paper, so we don't really need to emphasize that again. You don't need intro or conclusion markers. In conclusion, you should be able to tell as a reader when the writer is shifting towards a conclusion, and if you can't, there's probably something wrong with the synthesis, so we don't want to rely on things like in conclusion. And you don't really need to speak to the reader, as mentioned above, or as you may recall, any of those kinds of things. You don't really need to do that, and it's just clutter. So if we don't need those things, then we want to be precise and concise as best we can. Effective meta-discourse, again, dialogues with other scholars. So if you want to pit your idea against someone else's, as historian Ted Keller argued, but I will argue, and you can do that kind of move so that you can set up for your readers the dialogue that you're having with the evidence. And you can also put forward a claim, I argue, or I explore, or something like that, in order to signal to your reader that this is not an argument that is out there in the world just yet, and you're doing something new and different. And that's it. So we'll see how our choices shake out for our final draft.